Alyssa and Maria. Those were some really inspiring words. Thank you so much. You know, I get to do this job every day. I'm really so excited that I got to share a few minutes with you of how amazing and inspirational our students are. And speaking of inspiration, I get to introduce you to our dynamic, enchanting, contagious, and determined provost, Dr. Lula Demir.
Thank you so much, Curtis. Dean Wright, you may be pleased that the podium isn't shaped in one direction. I'm pleased I can see all of you over the top. It's indeed quite a pleasure to welcome Mr. Billy Collins here tonight as our 8th annual Kaufman-Repage Lecturer. And it's wonderful seeing all of you here in the audience. I'm thrilled to see students from my classes here, members of the board, members of our community, our faculty, our staff, all of the Wagner community here to celebrate the founding of Wagner College, as well as to hear about your remarkable journeys, for which we are truly grateful you allow us to take with you. Dubbed the most popular poet in America by Bruce Weber in the New York Times, Billy Collins is famous for conversational, witty poems that welcome readers with humor, but often slip into quirky, tender, or profound observation on the everyday, on reading and writing, and on poetry itself. John Updike praised Collins for writing lovely poems, limpid, gently, and consistently startling. More serious than they seem, they describe all the worlds that are and were, and some others besides. But Collins has offered a slightly different take on his appeal, admitting that his poetry is suburban, it's domestic, it's middle class, and it's sort of unashamedly that. Mr. Collins served 2 terms as a United States Poet Laureate from 2001 to 2003, was New York State Poet Laureate from 2004 to 2006, and is a regular guest on National Public Radio programs. A Publisher Weekly critic applauded his collection, Questions About Angels, Strange and Wonderful Images, but believed that the poems, which are often constricted by the novelty of a unifying metaphor, rarely induce an emotional reaction. In contrast, reviews of Collins' subsequent work regularly laud his ability to connect with readers. Discussing Picnic, Lightning, and its predecessor, The Art of Drowning, John Taylor noted that Mr. Collins' skillful, smooth style and inventive subject matter helps us feel the mystery of being alive. Taylor added, rarely has anyone written poems that appear so transparent on the surface, yet become so ambiguous, thought-provoking, or simply wise once the reader has peered into the depths. We applaud your tremendous and remarkable journey, and we thank you, Mr. Collins, for allowing us to walk that journey with you. Thank you very much for being here with us at Wagner. We're honored to welcome you and to hear your thoughts today. Mr. Collins will do a poetry reading followed by Q&A, and then we will have afterwards a book signing in the lobby and copies of his books available. Please join me again in welcoming Mr. Billy Collins.
Thank you very much. Such inspiring words from so many speakers here. Thank you for referring to me. And I'm glad to know I have a place in your classroom. Good to be here indeed. Such a coincidence, it's Founders Day. And water polo is not my favorite sport, but it's good to hear it recognized. Now, So I'm going to read some poems and talk about them, and not too determined to demystify them, but to make them seem maybe a little less mysterious. See, that's completely redundant there. And I thought I would, I had a lovely class today, very interesting talk with a small group of students. I thought it was interesting. I did a lot of talking. But we talked about, I felt a kind of obligation to readers, to get the reader on board and to establish and maintain a reader's attention. And some of my books, because of that, begin with a poem that is explicitly addressed to the reader, to reassure the reader that I'm aware of the reader's existence. So I'll start with one of those poems, and it's titled, You Reader. You Reader. I wonder how you are going to feel when you find out that I wrote this instead of you. That it was I who got up early to sit in the kitchen and mention with a pen the rain-soaked windows, the ivy wallpaper, and the goldfish circling in its bowl. Go ahead and turn aside, bite your lip and tear out the page. But listen, it was just a matter of time before one of us happened to notice the unlit candles and the clock humming on the wall. Plus, nothing happened that morning. A song on the radio, a car whistling along the road outside. And I was only thinking about the shakers of salt and pepper that were standing side by side on a placemat. I wondered if they had become friends after all these years, or if they were still strangers to one another, like you and I, who managed to be known and unknown to each other at the same time. Me at this table with a bowl of pears, you leaning in a doorway somewhere near some blue hydrangeas reading this. That's sort of an optimistic view of the reader there. Attentive as always. One of the lessons, of course, in learning how to write or taking writing classes is to avoid cliche. But cliches are interesting in themselves, and cliches secretly love to be turned on their heads. They'll never tell you that. So here's a poem called Adage. Adage. When it's late at night and branches are banging against the windows, you might think that love is just a matter of leaping out of the frying pan of yourself into the fire of someone else. But it's a little more complicated than that. It's more like trading the two birds who might be hiding in that bush for the one you are not holding in your hand. A wise man once said that love was like forcing a horse to drink, but then everyone stopped thinking of him as wise. Let us be clear about something. Love is not as simple as getting up on the wrong side of the bed wearing the emperor's clothes. No, it's more like the way the pen feels after it has defeated the sword. It's a little like the penny saved or the 9 drop stitches. You look at me through the halo of the last candle and tell me that love is an ill wind that has no turning, a road that blows no good. But I am here to remind you, as our shadows tremble on the walls, that love is the early bird who is better late than never. Thank you very much. And this is, well, the poem begins anyway with a kind of phenomenon of natural life in America, and goes from there, and it's called The Sandhill Cranes of Nebraska. Too bad you weren't here 6 months ago, was a lament I heard on my visit to Nebraska. You could have seen the astonishing spectacle of the sandhill cranes, thousands of them feeding and even dancing on the shores of the Platte River. There was no point in pointing out the impossibility of my being there then, because I happened to be somewhere else. So I nodded and put on a look of mild disappointment, if only to be part of the commiseration. It was the same look I remember wearing about 6 months ago in Georgia, when I was told that I had just missed the spectacular annual outburst of azaleas, brilliant against the green backdrop of spring. And the same in Vermont 6 months before that, when I arrived shortly after the magnificent foliage had gloriously peaked. Mother Nature, as she is called, having touched the hills with her many-colored brush. A phenomenon that occurs, like the others, around the same time every year, when I am apparently off in another state, stuck in a motel lobby with the local paper and a styrofoam cup of coffee, busily missing God knows why. I think behind every poem is some either a little nugget of influence or indebtedness or a major one. In that case, I don't think I could have written that poem were it not for a previous poet laureate and a terrific poet, Howard Nemeroff,
Yes.
who at one point, a number of us writers were asked to make up a word for kind of a dictionary of new words. But the point was not to be funny, it was to actually identify, if you could, what linguists I think call a hole in the language, a place where a word belonged and was and did not exist. So anyway, the results of course were varied, but Nemeroff I thought had the best word in this dictionary, and it was a verb, transitive verb, very transitive verb, you might say, and it was the verb to azaleate. And to azaleate someone meant to commiserate needlessly with some visitor about a natural attraction that they just missed because they arrived too late, or they will miss because they're leaving too early. So you have probably either azaleated, been azaleated, or both. Now you know. Well, that leads into this poem a little bit in that here, that's a little nugget of appreciation or indebtedness. I was sort of optional of me telling you that, but in this case, here's an example of a poem in which the most explicit kind of indebtedness is expressed to a previous poem. And it occurs when a poet wants to write a version of someone else's poem. And there is a protocol involved, and the protocol is that you use the same title, and then under the title, and before the poem begins, you write the expression after with the name of the poet. So you would say after Neruda, or after Whitman, or after Emily Dickinson. I wanted to write a poem, a version of a poem by the Chinese poet Li Po, and he has a lovely poem called Drinking Alone. And so I set out, and I began confidently by writing Drinking Alone at the top of the page, and then I wrote after Li Po, dutifully, and then I got completely entangled in the expression after Li Po, having stared at the page with nothing on it but those two lines. Drinking Alone after Li Po. This is not after Li Po the way the state is after me for neglecting to pay all my taxes, nor the way I am after the woman in front of me on the long line at the post office. Li Po, I am not saying after you, as I stand holding open one of the heavy glass doors that divide the centuries in a long corridor of glass doors. No, the only way this is after you is in the way they say, it's just one thing after another. Like the way I will pause to raise a glass of wine to you after I finish writing this poem. So let me get back to sitting in the wind alone among the pines with a pencil in my hand. After all, you had your turn, and mine will soon be done. Then someone else will sit here after me. You know, we mentioned in class, and it was mentioned in the air tonight, about poems arising out of small things, that the little things around us can be keyholes into much larger rooms of consideration. And here's a poem with a rather mundane beginning. It's called Cheerios. Cheerios. One bright morning in a restaurant in Chicago, as I waited for my eggs and toast, I opened the Tribune only to discover that I was the same age as Cheerios. Indeed, I was a few months older than Cheerios, for today the newspaper announced was the 70th birthday of Cheerios, whereas mine had occurred earlier in the year. Already I could hear them whispering behind my stooped and threadbare back, "Why, that dude's older than Cheerios." The way they used to say, "Why, that's as old as the hills." Only the hills are much older than Cheerios, or any American breakfast cereal, and more enduring and noble are the hills, I surmised, as a bar of sunlight illuminated my orange juice. Thank you. Here's something that poets get that other writers don't get, I'm quite sure. I've asked around. It's like a survey, asking around, or just short of a survey. Poets, I won't say what it is, you'll see, but no other, dramatists don't get this, novelists don't get this, only poets. It's called the suggestion box. It all began fairly early in the day, at the coffee shop as it turned out, when the usual waitress said, "I bet you're going to write a poem about this," after she had knocked a cup of coffee into my lap. Then later in the morning I was told by a student that I should write a poem about the fire drill that was going on as we all stood on the lawn outside our building. In the afternoon, a woman I barely knew said, "You could write a poem about that," pointing to a dirigible that was passing overhead. And if all that were not enough, a friend turned to me as we walked past a man whose face was covered with tattoos and said, "I see a poem coming." Why is everyone being so helpful? I wondered that evening by the shore of a lake. Maybe I should write a poem about all the people who think they know what I should be writing poems about. It was just then, in the fading light, that I spotted a pair of ducks emerging from a cluster of reeds to paddle out to open water. The female glancing back over her russet shoulder, just in time to see me searching my pockets for a pen. I knew it, she quacked, with a bit of a brogue. "But who can blame you for following your heart," she went on. "Now go write a lovely poem about me and the mister." Only once did some friend of mine, another poet, said, we were talking about the monkeys who, the three monkeys who see no evil, hear no evil, and speak no evil. And she said, "You could write a poem about that." And I said, "You're right," and I did. I'm not going to read it, but that was the only time she was right. Here's a poem. Well, actually, let me read the title of this new book that I wish were available tonight, but the publisher is very fussy about this. It's like a Christmas present, so it can't be released until Tuesday. Yeah, so you'll have to wait till Tuesday. You've waited all this time. Anyway, so Tuesday, it's just around the corner. Tuesday will always, publication day is always disappointing because, one of the less intelligent questions you get asked in interviews if you're a writer, they might ask you, "Well, what's your favorite word?" And there's so many. One British writer said, "Well, I think swallow would probably be my favorite word." She said, "Well, the noun or the verb?" I said, "Both." But someone said that every writer actually has the same favorite word, and the word is forthcoming. Because this period now, before the book comes out, is full of optimism and hope. And it's also, this period is also referred to as the calm before the calm. So this is the small c followed by the capital C calm. At any rate, I'd like to read, the title of the book is Aimless Love, and it's the title of one of the poems, so I'll read that one. It's a comparison, as you'll see, between two kinds of love. Aimless love. This morning as I walked along the lakeshore, I fell in love with a wren, and later in the day with a mouse the cat had dropped under the dining room table. In the shadows of an autumn evening, I fell for a seamstress, still at her machine in the tailor's window, and later for a bowl of broth, steam rising like smoke from a naval battle. This is the best kind of love, I thought, without recompense, without gifts or unkind words, without suspicion or silence on the telephone, the love of the chestnut, the jazz cap, and one hand on the steering wheel. No lust, no slam of the door, the love of the miniature orange tree, the clean white shirt, the hot evening shower, that highway that cuts across Florida. No waiting, no huffiness or rancor, just a twinge every now and then for the wren who had built her nest on a low branch overhanging the water, and for the dead mouse still dressed in its light brown suit. But my heart is always propped up in a field on its tripod, ready for the next arrow. After I carried the mouse by the tail to a pile of leaves in the woods, I found myself standing at the bathroom sink, gazing down affectionately at the soap, so patient and soluble, so at home in its pale green soap dish. I could feel myself falling again as I felt its turning in my wet hands and caught the scent of lavender and stone. Thank you. And this is a poem that has a real subject matter, and the subject matter is adolescence. Some of you are committing it right now. Anyway, it's addressed to a specific example of that phase of life. And I think adolescence really just was invented in 1955. It's not that old. With Rebel Without a Cause, I think. Prior to that, if you see what are supposed to be teenagers in movies, they just look like little adults doing things that are too silly for adult behavior. But anyway, now we have graduate school where adolescence can be extended into your early 30s or beyond. Anyway, so this is addressed to and the title will tell you, to someone. And it's called To My Favorite 17-Year-Old High School Girl. Do you realize if you had started building the Parthenon on the day you were born, you would be all done in only one more year? But of course you couldn't have done that all alone, so never mind. You're fine just as you are. You are loved for simply being yourself. But did you know that at your age, Judy Garland was pulling down $150,000 a picture, Joan of Arc was leading the French army to victory, and Blaise Pascal had cleaned up his room? No, wait, I mean he had invented the calculator. Of course, there'll be time for all that later in your life, after you come out of your room and begin to blossom, or at least pick up all your socks. For some reason, I keep remembering that Lady Jane Grey was Queen of England when she was only 15, but then she was beheaded, so never mind her as a role model. But a few centuries later, when he was your age, Franz Schubert was doing the dishes for his family, but that did not keep him from composing 2 symphonies, 4 operas, and 2 complete masses as a youngster. But of course that was in Austria at the height of Romantic lyricism, not here in the suburbs of Cleveland. Frankly, who cares if Annie Oakley was a crack shot at 15, or if Maria Callas debuted as Tosk at 17, we think you are special by just being you, playing with your food and staring into space. By the way, I lied about Schubert doing the dishes, but that doesn't mean he never helped out around the house. So if we were in the South, I'd have to say, bless her heart, right? Okay. Here's a poem, a little poem about a dog, and it's just 12 lines long. It's actually spoken it's spoken by a dog, or you can imagine actually written by a dog. And the dog, you'll see, is a sensitive creature. It's called The Dog on His Master. Master seems like such a bad word to describe that relationship, as does ownership. I love this. You've probably seen this bumper sticker that's in the shape of a paw, and inside the paw it asks you the question, who rescued who? Good question. Anyway, the dog, it's called a Dog on His Master. As young as I look, I am growing older faster than he. 7-to-1 is the ratio they tend to say. Whatever the number, I will pass him one day and take the lead, the way I do on our walks in the woods. And if this ever manages to cross his mind, it would be the sweetest shadow I have ever cast on snow or grass. I've never heard of, but I recognized right away what he was up to. He was up to the same thing that male European love poets had been up to since the 13th century, which is that he was attempting to impress a woman by comparing her to things in nature, that her eyes were like stars, etc. I just had enough of that at that point. And I thought back immediately to Shakespeare's sonnet, "My mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun," where he just turns that whole convention or maneuver really upside down. You'd think that would have put an end to it, but it continues in an unabated manner. And it seemed to rest, when I thought about it, as I got more and more irritated, that it seemed to rest on this presumption that men had about women, that men seemed to understand what women really wanted. And what they were onto was that women, what they really wanted in their hearts was neither passion, nor fidelity, nor respect, nor companionship. What women wanted were similes. They just wanted to be compared to stuff. So I kind of rewrote the poem for this poet by taking the first 2 lines of his poem and just recasting the whole thing. And so the epigraph I use here is the first 2 lines of his poem. He says, he begins, by the way, this poem that he wrote goes on for about 40 lines until he just kind of runs out of metaphoric gas, and that's the end of the poem. It doesn't really go anywhere. But it begins, his opening, his gambit is to say to her, "You are the bread and the knife, the crystal goblet and the wine." Litany. You are the bread and the knife, the crystal goblet and the wine. You are the dew on the morning grass and the burning wheel of the sun. You are the white apron of the baker and the marsh bird suddenly in flight. However, you are not the wind in the orchard, the plums on the counter, or the house of cards, and you are certainly not the pine-scented air. There is no way you are the pine-scented air. It is possible that you are the fish under the bridge, maybe even the pigeon on the general's head, but you are not even close to being the field of cornflowers at dusk. And a quick look in the mirror will show that you are neither the boots in the corner nor the boat asleep in its boathouse. It might interest you to know, speaking of the plentiful imagery of the world, that I am the sound of rain on the roof, I also happen to be the shooting star, the evening paper blowing down an alley, and the basket of chestnuts on the kitchen table. I am also the moon in the trees and the blind woman's teacup. But don't worry, I am not the bread and the knife. You are still the bread and the knife. You will always be the bread and the knife, not to mention the crystal goblet, and somehow the wine. The contributor's note in that magazine, when I looked to see who this dude was, it just said his name and it said he lives in Belgium. And I thought, that's safe enough. But then I ran into this guy from Belgium. I said, have you heard of this guy? He said, yeah, he's a poet and he's a really well-known Belgian cyclist. Wins all these races and stuff. So he might be bicycling to get me. So here's a poem. This is the high season for this kind of thing has passed. The high season for this is mid-April, but it's a poem about something that takes place at camp in the summertime, or at least it took place at my camp, and a lot of it in the summertime. And one of the things about this poem is I was saying to the class today, I try not to get too far ahead of the reader. I try to maybe somebody said it. There's a good thing to start the poem in Kansas and then move to Oz gradually. And I start with the familiar and then kind of drift into some less known, sketchier territory. And that I have a very short patience or no patience for poems that seem to begin in Oz. I don't know how the poet got there, but he didn't take me there. So I need to be transported there. But whether this ends up in Oz is not the point, but I try to start this poem by telling you exactly how it started with me. And it's called The Lanyard. The other day, as I was ricocheting slowly off the pale blue walls of this room, bouncing from typewriter to piano, from bookshelf to an envelope lying on the floor, I found myself in the L section of the dictionary, where my eyes fell upon the word lanyard. No cookie nibbled by a French novelist could send one more suddenly into the past, a past where I sat at a workbench at a camp by a deep Adirondack lake, learning how to braid thin plastic strips into a lanyard, a gift from my mother. I had never seen anyone use a lanyard, or wear one if that's what you did with them, but that did not keep me from crossing strand over strand, again and again, until I had made a boxy red and white lanyard for my mother. She gave me life and milk from her breasts, and I gave her a lanyard. She nursed me in many a sick room, lifted teaspoons of medicine to my lips, set cold face cloths on my forehead, and then led me out into the airy light and taught me to walk and to swim, and I in turn presented her with a lanyard. Here are thousands of meals, she said, and here is clothing and a good education. And here is your lanyard, I replied, which I made with a little help from a counselor. Here is a breathing body and a beating heart, strong legs, bones and teeth, and 2 clear eyes to read the world, she whispered. And here, I said, is the lanyard I made at camp. And here I wish to say to her now is a smaller gift, not the archaic truth that you can never repay your mother, but the rueful admission that when she took the 2-tone lanyard from my hands, I was as sure as a boy could be that this useless, worthless thing I wove out of boredom would be enough to make us even. It's a rather amazing exchange that when you first, it's the first thing you make for your parents. I mean, my camp, you could either make, well, we had this, it was called Arts and Crafts or something. And by the way, I said a deep Adirondack lake, right, where the camp took place. So a couple of people have said, what camp was that in the Adirondacks? And I have to tell him, well, it's actually, I went to camp in the Catskills. And I said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, it's a sound effect. It's Adirondack. It's like, it's almost Italian. Adirondack. And Catskills. The Catskills would be called the spondy in prosody, Catskills. So there is rhythm triumphing over fact. But anyway, we had arts and crafts, and we had this counselor, a completely useless individual, who would just have us do busy work while he went out and smoked for an hour. But one day he came in with a very serious expression, and he said, you know, you have to bring something home to one of your parents that you've made with your own little hands as a sign of gratitude, I was imagining, for having gotten rid of me for the summer. And he said, you can make a pot holder or a lanyard. And you have to tell me tomorrow at 10 o'clock. I didn't sleep. The decision seemed so life-changing and potentially irrevocable. It was just like the frost with the two roads diverging. Anyway, but I came up with the lanyard. Otherwise, I would have written a book called The Pot Holder. My friends went to fancier camps, more exclusive camps. They had a wider range of possibilities for how to express your gratitude to your parents. And one of them would be they could make a coffee cup for Dad, right? Because they had ceramics, and they had these things called kilns. I never heard the word kiln before. I was 7 years old or whatever. I thought kiln was like some weird verb form of kill. I mean, to have kiln or something. But they were too, of course these children were too inept to put handles on these coffee cups, so they were equally as useless as the lanyard. In fact, one mother confided in me, and she said these handleless coffee cups are known as lanyard holders. That's where the lanyard goes. In case you're looking for it, find it in the lanyard holder. Okay, I'm just going to read, I'm going to wind up here, the beginning of the end here. Let me read a poem. A tiny love poem. Not as tiny as a tweet, but what the hell? Is it? Yeah, it's a little love poem. It's called Carry, just the verb carry. I want to carry you, and for you to carry me, the way voices are said to carry over water. Just this morning on the shore, I could hear two people talking quietly in a rowboat on the far side of the lake. They were talking about fishing, then one changed the subject, and I swear they began talking about you. That's when you're really gone. You start hearing things. Okay. Okay, just one other love poem, because it's all gravitating. The poems start out in so many directions, but then there's these kind of magnetic poles. Basically, either it's about mortality or love. Those are, all poems are kind of like water. They just seek out one of those two levels. But all you can do as a poet is try to come up with some new metaphor for these things. And this metaphor just came out of a memory of being at the beach as a child. And it's called Orient. You are turning me like someone turning a globe in her hand. And yes, I have another side, like a china no one, not even me, has ever seen. So describe to me what's there. Say what you are looking at, and I will close my eyes so I can see it too. The ox carts and all the lively flags. I love the sound of your voice, like a little saxophone, telling me what I could never know unless I dug a hole all the way down through the core of myself. Thank you. So I'll just read. Two poems, is that okay?
Yeah.
All right, good. And this, because I started out saying about how often little things will turn into larger things. And when I started writing this poem, I just wanted to, I think I'd seen an old movie or had some memory, and I wanted to write a poem about how men used to wear fedora hats in cities, and that this was basically almost a rule, and that stopped. And later someone told me it really stopped right around the time of John Kennedy, because he didn't wear a hat, and men sort of wanted to look like him and not so much like, Eisenhower or somebody. I mentioned that Kennedy sort of inadvertently, of course, put the hat business out of business, and a woman came up to me after a poetry reading, and the audiences at poetry readings, not you, but they're not as stable as other audiences. And she said to me, you mentioned about she said, do you know what killed the paperweight? I said, no. I just took a step back, and she said, air conditioning. She was quite right. Because in offices, before air conditioning, all the windows would be open in the summer, and breezes blowing, and so everything would have to be weighted down. So air conditioning turned the paperweight from an object of utility into a curio. And if you've learned nothing here tonight, take that with you. All right, so that's the way the poem started, and it's called The Death of the Hat. Once every man wore a hat. In the ashen newsreels, the avenues of cities are broad rivers flowing with hats. The ballparks swelled with thousands of straw hats, brims and bands, rows of men smoking and cheering in shirt sleeves. Hats were the law. They went without saying. You noticed a man in a crowd without a hat. You bought them from Adams or Dobbs, who branded your initials in gold on the inside band. Trolleys crisscrossed the city. Steamships sailed in and out of the harbor. Men with hats gathered on the docks. There was a person to block your hat, and a hat-checked girl to mind it while you had a drink or ate a steak with peas and a baked potato. In your office stood a hat rack. The day war was declared, everyone in the street was wearing a hat, and they were wearing hats when a ship loaded with men and women sank in the icy sea. My father wore one to work every day and returned home carrying the evening paper, the winter chill radiating from his overcoat. But today we go bareheaded into the winter streets, stand hatless on frozen platforms. Today, the mailboxes on the roadside and the spruce trees behind the house wear cold white hats of snow. Mice scurry from the stone walls at night in their thin fur hats to eat the birdseed that has spilled. And now my father, after a life of work, wears a hat of earth, and on top of that, a lighter one of cloud and sky, a hat of wind. So thank you. I'll just read one more. And I do want to thank President Garassi, of course, and Mrs. Garassi, Provost McNair, who met me and is still taking care of me, and but particularly the Repage Kaufman family, and for your generosity in funding this series. I think it's a terrific thing you're doing. So the last poem is called Forgetfulness, and it's just a kind of meditation on that. It starts out by talking about forgetting stuff you've read, forgetting books. Forgetfulness. The name of the author is the first to go, followed obediently by the title, the plot, the heartbreaking conclusion, the entire novel, which suddenly becomes one you have never read, never even heard of. It is as if one by one the memories you used to harbor decided to retire to the southern hemisphere of the brain, to a little fishing village where there are no phones. Long ago you kissed the names of the 9 muses goodbye, and you watched the quadratic equation pack its bag. And even now, as you memorize the order of the planets, something else is slipping away. The state flower, perhaps, the address of an uncle, the capital of Paraguay. Whatever it is you are struggling to remember, it is not poised on the tip of your tongue, not even lurking in some obscure corner of your spleen. It has floated away down a dark mythological river whose name begins with an L as far as you can recall. Well on your own way to oblivion, where you will join those who have forgotten even how to swim and how to ride a bicycle. No wonder you rise in the middle of the night to look up the date of a battle in a book on war. No wonder the moon in the window seems to have drifted out of a love poem that you used to know by heart. Thank you so much. So much. So, if you need to go to class or not go to class, you're excused. But if you wanted to stay just for a brief conversation about anything, if you have questions, you can just shout them out, and I will repeat them. Oh, there you are. Here are the lads. Now, don't be intimidated by these guys. They mean peace. They mean no harm. No bodily harm will be done to you. No bopping with the microphones. So, I don't know. Anybody want to throw out a question? They're mesmerized.
This gentleman over here.
Where is he? Okay.
You've got a wonderful sense of being a little removed in your poems, which I like very much, but I'm wondering, thinking of all the poets that 45 years ago, 50 years ago, I learned about here at Wagner, if you've ever really written any passionate poetry, any Edna St. Vincent Millay or Emily Dickinson kind of things.
Well, as a child, I did.
And then you turned from childless things?
I put away childless things. Well, there's feeling bubbling under the surface of some of these things. I mean, that elegy for my father, for one, and some of the love poems. But I'm really trying to avoid, in my poetry, I'm trying to avoid two things: sentimentality, soft-heartedness on the one hand, and sarcasm on the other hand. And I'm probably trying to avoid those two things because I have a weakness for both of them. I'm an easy cry, and I can be a real cynical bastard sometimes. And what I'm trying to do is, there's a middle road for that. It's called irony. And I'm trying to just keep the bicycle on that line, because I know I could fall on either side. And that poise is probably, I think what you're missing is the result of trying to keep that balance. Yeah, but the outcries of poetry are just, they've been fairly stifled, like I fall upon the thorns of life, I bleed kind of thing. Yeah, you like that. Yeah, you want more of that. It's funky stuff. You can't get enough. It's good. It's all good. It's just that, I don't know, have you read much poetry in the last 45 years? Because it changes.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, but it's a good question. It's a sharp observation.
Do you think that the kind of style or the kind of perspective you're taking is pretty common in American poetry?
I think so. Yeah. Well, there's an anthology that came out maybe 2 or 3 years ago called Seriously Funny, and it's an anthology of American poets who are humorous, who use humor as a strategy, you might say, but are quite serious. I mean, they're not there to entertain or be silly. They're quite serious about you know, the bedrock interests of poetry, which are still the same. They're about love and mortality. And have I mentioned mortality? You know, there's only a few things poetry is about, someone said. One is, you know, I went out in the woods today and felt, you know, kind of religious. That's one. Another one is we're not getting any younger. Another one is it sure is lonely here without you, baby, or with you, baby, depending on the relationship. And then I don't know what else there is to say, you know, but it's just a matter of different tonal approaches to those basic subjects. Sir? Oh, sir. Oh, you. I thought you had a question. Okay. Sorry.
I was told to click mute.
That's a bit of cynicism on the part of the student.
I guess they're good. I'd like to, well, first of all, I had the pleasure of hearing you on Prairie Home Companion a number of years ago, and recall in particular the poem about the lanyard and the poem about the dog. Really enjoyed your work very much. But let me pick up on that theme and sort of give you an opportunity to say, what is it that you try to accomplish when you sit down to develop a poem? What is it that you're trying to do? And I do think there was passion in much of what you had to say.
Well, I feel lucky that I'm just writing it all when I start. If I feel some momentum that an initiating line or some glimmer of a notion gives me, I'm very excited. I don't have any work habits, you know, I don't sit down to write at certain times of the day. I'm with Max Beerbaum, who said that the most difficult thing about being a poet was to figure out what to do with the remaining 23 and a half hours of the day. He also said, the ant sets an example for us all, but it is not a good one. So, I don't think I'm, you know, the idea of trying to accomplish sounds a little too formal for me. Like when I'm writing, I'm not trying to accomplish anything. It's much more like Auden said, it's like cabinet making. I'm really trying to make one solid line after the next. You know, some poet said, no line must sleep. Every line has to be wakeful and aware, kind of aware of the lines around it. And I'm trying to make good stanzas, because early on I'll make a decision to make 3 or 4 line stanzas or some kind of formal pattern the poem has. And then I'm also trying to follow some kind of imaginative thread of associations that would lead me from the hat to my father, for example, or from the lanyard to my mother. And following that pattern is basically what I'm trying to accomplish and bring the poem to a satisfying ending, where, as I said to the class today, a point where I don't want to say anymore and you don't want to hear anymore. Everyone's happy. You know, I'm done and you've had enough. And that's a very satisfying feeling. And that's what I get a feeling of accomplishment from finishing. Yeah.
What teacher or librarian led you towards writing?
What teacher led me to write? I don't know. My mother was the bait. You know, they have something to do with all this, apparently. It's those mothers, my friend said. 25 years of therapy. It's those mothers. Anyway, my mother would say poetry. She was born on a farm in Ontario in 1901. So when she learned her poetry, when she was a schoolgirl, you know, it would be before anything, before radio, television. Memorization, of course, was a very legitimate way to teach poetry. So she was not a literary person, but she had hundreds and hundreds of lines of poems in her head. And so when I was a child, before I even heard the word poetry, I would just be in the kitchen or something, playing on the floor or whatever. But I knew my mother had 2 ways of talking. She had one regular way to talk when she was like yelling at me or whatever, or at my father. She wasn't like that, actually. But then she had this other way of talking. It sounded better. It sounded different. And I didn't even know it was called poetry. It was like my mother had AM and FM. And I could hear her switch. The modulation was very clear. This was this other kind of talk. So I knew what poetry was in my ear before I knew what poetry was as a word. You know? So that was very early. More teachers discouraged me than anything. I went to Christian Brothers High School and Catholic and Jesuit college, where self-expression was thought to be sinful, basically, or a near occasion of sin. So they would tell me just to stop, read some Gerard Manley Hopkins and get this out of your system, because that was, But those teachers had a real influence on me because I have a much keener appetite for revenge than I do a need for approval. If you approve and say, good job, keep doing that, I'll just say, stop patting me on the head, please. But the people who discouraged me really inspired me. And quite frankly, in 2001, when I received a call from the Librarian of Congress in Washington appointing me the U.S. Poet Laureate, I thought about those teachers who discouraged me, and it just added some honey to the whole experience. So discouragement can work just as well
Your
as...
style as you write, do you constantly rewrite, or do you find you just flow and do some minor changes?
Flowing is good when it works, but I wish I write it in a notebook, right? And then I will, sometimes it comes out, if it's a short poem, like the poem Divorce or something really short, it's just there. I mean, apparently Duke Ellington wrote Mood Indigo in like 10 minutes, but there's a lot of work behind and experience behind it. But usually if it's a longer poem or it's a regular poem, I write it out once, I'll write it out a second time, just keep turning the pages of the same notebook, a third time, a fourth time maybe a fifth time, but usually 3 or 4. And every draft I'm making is, it's refining it, it's changing, making metrical changes, and that's, I just do that until it feels finished. But the conceptual run of the poem usually takes place in the first draft, like beginning to end, like from the hat to the hats, the snow hats and the mice hats and my father's hat. That's usually done in one sitting. It could be hours, but then the other drafts are just trying to make it a little better. It's not revision, because revision means seeing it again. It's just refinement, I think. But revision is, someone said that revision in writing is not cleaning up after the party. Revision is the party, because revision, you want to make it good. That's the party, that's the fun. You're making something no one's ever made before. And you're driving the poem to an ending that didn't exist before you wrote the poem. And that's all very exciting, that the poem then becomes a path. The only way to access the ending of that poem is the poem that you just wrote. Maybe one more? Yeah, way back there? Well, way back there, yeah. Hi.
I just really wanted to say that I really appreciated your style, how anyone can relate to it, no matter how old, no matter which background we come from, and I thought that was
Or how young.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's pretty special because it's hard, especially with irony, for everyone at least to be able to understand that. And so thank you for sharing that. And also, I just moved here from Belgium, so I was wondering, out of curiosity, what's the name of the poet that rides a bicycle, just out of curiosity? I'm French, I'm not Belgian, so I'm gonna guess.
Okay, I've never told any audience, but his name, his name is in the book. His name is Jacques Criquillon.
Oh, okay.
Jacques Criquillon, yeah. And he's a famous cyclist. And not so famous poet. But there's always one Belgian audience.
Thank you so much.
So, okay, very good.
Thank you.